I recently viewed a video about Battlefield 5 Gunplay Mechanics analysis, actually more than one. I got a bit curious, so I thought, is there some way to objectively show how it works without putting mine or any other dude's opinion into it? Turns out, it's very possible, which was shown by WackyJacky in a video from 2018. Now, 2018 isn't exactly yesterday. I mean, some kids weren't even born in 2018. So I thought, what about Battlefield 5 today? Let's show how Battlefield 5 gunplay actually works and how you can handle it. I'm Zach. I hope you find this video useful, and if you do, consider throwing a thumbs up. If not, toss in a thumbs down and let me know. Either way, I really appreciate the honesty. Let's start by how we do this. If you only want to see the results on how to handle recoil, spread, etc., just check out the timeline below for the different chapters. Still here? Well, let's go then! I will use several tools to try and show how the recoil and spread works, but for starters I will use the tracer ammo in Battlefield 5. It means that just by shooting in the air I can actually see the pattern and draw a diagram. However, Battlefield 5 doesn't show all the bullets as tracer ammo, but it gives a pretty good picture anyway. Next up, I'm calling the vertical recoil for recoil. In other words, you fire a shot and the rifle pushes upwards. And I call the horizontal spread for spread, which means that when you fire multiple shots and they get horizontal spread, well, that's spread. Now that we know what recoil and spread is, let's get to work. For starters, I've picked the Sturmgewehr 1.5 and I've reset all properties to get a good baseline. I'm using a NIDA sight, but that doesn't really matter, except that it's not in the way at least. So, how much recoil and spread do we get when just hip firing standing? I'm just going to use the full auto mode, push the button and see what happens. Now, that's a lot of recoil, but also a lot of spread. Basically, there are bullets all over the place and I'm probably just going to be happy if any hits my target. Remember that this is before any upgrades to enhance hipfire. So what about ADS or ADS? Now, the pattern is completely different. The spread is very limited, but the recoil is still there and about the same. By drawing lines between the outer bullets, we get a pretty good picture of how much difference there is in spread and recoil between standing, hipfire and ADS. What about when we crouch? The spread is about the same, but the recoil has decreased a lot. Not too bad. Proning further decreases the recoil, which makes sense. The behavior of increased control when crouching and proning has been a thing all along in Battlefield series. Okay, so now we have established a difference in recoil when we fire standing, crouching and proning. How consistent is it? Is it just random or is there a fixed pattern? Now, that is definitely some random deviation going on here. But the main pattern is still the same. This is important because that means that we should be able to control it without letting the rifle rest. Now, not 100% because there is some randomness going on, but it's not deviating too much, so adjusting how we fire and counter gun movements should allow us to get a very controlled fire. Now look at that, a nicely controlled fire. I'm going to return to different techniques for how to handle this later in the video, but for now just compare the original result with what you can adjust pretty easily. Not bad, huh? Almost like some developer made it on purpose. Before we move on to the semi-automatic weapons, let's have a look at the ZK and why it's that popular. Again, to get a good baseline, I'm resetting the properties. After all, this is what you get out of the box, then you can tune the gun to your liking. For instance, with ZK you can get an increased fire rate, but we're not diving into the upgrades now. First we do the hipfire thing and then the ADS. Now, if you remember this STG, there is a very clear difference here, which partly explains why the ZK is that popular, and partly shows that different guns have different patterns. The spread is very limited with the ZK, there is almost just recoil. We'll get back to that later when we talk about different techniques to manage recoil and spread, but in general, just know that recoil, especially fairly consistent recoil, is much easier to manage than spread. Random spread in particular, that is. As an example of a semi-automatic weapon, I picked the M1 Garand. Mostly because I like it, it's a damn fine gun. Probably the sweetest gun in the entire game. According to hearsay, only automatic weapons are affected by spread, like assault rifles, SMGs, LMGs and MMGs. Let's put it to the test. First standing, hipfire, we clearly see a lot of spread. is just as bad as when we tried the STG before, but adds is pretty much only recoil. So is the myth busted? Pretty much all guns in Battlefield have a spread when hipfire. You can decrease it by different properties, but you won't get rid of it completely. This means that hipfire will only work at close range, and that is probably how DICE wants it. However, when switching to adds and single fire mode, any weapon gets a very narrow spread, or pretty much none at all, but you need to manage recoil instead. That actually means that if you fire rapidly in single mode, you can be very effective. It's a bit limited since the fire rate is restricted, but it's still valid. Let's check out the Magnum, just to show the difference in hipfire and adds. Notice how the recoil with the Magnum is a bit interesting. It doesn't continue to climb, so all shots from the second or third are basically hitting the same spot. This emphasizes the need to try and see how different guns and rifles work to get the full potential. Let's talk some techniques to manage the recoil and spread. The game provides help for some weapons, like being able to switch between full auto and single fire. Some guns even offer burst mode or slower fire rate, but still full auto. You can actually do all these things manually with any full auto weapon. You can burst by holding fire button for 2 to 3 shots. You can obviously do single fire, but not that fast. And finally, you can use a slightly lower fire rate in full auto mode. Depending on the game, some of these techniques are likely more or less obsolete. For Battlefield 5, I don't consider manual burst good enough. Firing 2 to 3 shots and letting the gun rest requires that most shots hits and or that they do quite a lot of damage. Like in old CS 1.5 maybe, you could burst the AK as a mean to put 1 or 2 bullets around the head area, most likely killing with 1 or 2 bursts at range. Another important part in Battlefield 5 is that the spread even with full auto is more controllable at range, which contributes to burst mode being obsolete. Firing single shots is usually not worth it either in Battlefield 5, either the gun actually has switched to single mode, in which way that is much better, or the gun doesn't do enough damage at long range with a single hit. The last technique is to slightly decrease fire rate by clicking the shots, even in full auto mode. It's the one that I think usually is the most viable in Battlefield 5. Even at medium range you can control the spread quite well without too much effort, and the recoil is usually quite controllable. So, how do you manage recoil? Recoil in Battlefield 5 is like a spring, a recoil spring. You fire and your gun raises, but as soon as you stop fire it goes back down again. Like in many other games, recoil that is pretty consistent and doesn't spread too much can be controlled by simply dragging the mouse down at a consistent speed. If you haven't done it before, it takes probably a few tries to get a hang of it, but once you get flow, it gives you the opportunity to fire very fast and still keep recoil completely at bay. A hot tip if you play Overwatch, by the way, with Baptiste. What about spread then? Well, spread is much harder to control. In general, when playing a game that has a lot of spread, you either learn the pattern if it's fixed, or you counter by lowering fire rate, etc. if the pattern is random. In Battlefield 5 we saw earlier that the pattern is random, but we also saw that unless we hipfire, there isn't much spread to talk about. By linking gun movement with the feedback that Battlefield 5 gives us, like tracer bullets, hit markers, dust, etc., you can do minor adjustments for spread as well. But don't go too hard on that path or you might end up in Narnia. Well, that's it for today. I hope this helps you get in control of your gun to understand how Battlefield 5 spread and recoil works. If you're more interested in different strategies, beginners 10 tips, whatever, just check out videos here on my right and left.